Maggie stepped into the cafe with a feeling of hope. She had always been drawn to the beauty of the city, a sprawling metropolis full of gleaming towers and alien architecture. Today, she'd chosen a small, upscale cafe that came highly recommended by a friend, a place known for its eclectic mix of art and culture, where humans like her were often in the minority. But that was fine. She had learned over the years to live with the discomfort of being one of the few Earthlings in this far-off corner of the galaxy. The cafe's walls were adorned with strange, vibrant paintings, abstract pieces from alien artists she barely understood. The scent of something floral and spicy wafted through the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation. It was a pleasant, calming atmosphere. Maggie had left behind her hectic life in Earth's quieter suburbs, yearning for a moment to herself. She had spent most of her days in isolation after her husband passed, filling her time with books and lectures on Earth's history. Today, though, she was seeking something more personal, something that didn't involve an academic pursuit. She walked up to the counter, where a tall, slender alien with shimmering green skin and multicolored eyes greeted her with a polite smile that seemed almost practiced. "Hello," Maggie said, her voice steady but carrying the slight tremor of someone who was still trying to get used to life on a foreign planet. "I'd like a coffee, please." The barista's smile faltered slightly as his eyes scanned her. Maggie couldn't quite place the look, but she chalked it up to the usual alien curiosity. She was used to feeling like an outsider in places like this, and she didn't mind it. In fact, she had come to embrace the idea that she was a rare relic, just as much a piece of history as the ancient books she cherished. The barista hesitated, then spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you want to sit here? This is a space for more cultured patrons." Maggie blinked, not understanding at first. "Excuse me?" He lowered his voice, glancing at the other patrons. "I mean, the human presence here, it disrupts the aesthetic. It's not really—" He waved his hand dismissively, as if the thought was beneath him. Maybe the common room would be more appropriate. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She had faced subtle discrimination in this alien city before, being ignored by shopkeepers, her purchases scrutinized by clerks, but never had she felt so openly dismissed. She fought to keep her composure. "I just want a coffee," she said, her voice firm but steady. "I'll sit wherever I please." The barista's smile twisted into something thin, almost condescending. He didn't say anything more but took her order with a marked lack of enthusiasm. She paid and took a seat at a small table by the window, hoping that the awkwardness of the interaction would fade. It was the perfect spot. She could watch the alien pedestrians outside and lose herself in the quiet of the afternoon. But the peace she had hoped for didn't come. A pair of aliens seated nearby started whispering, their eyes glancing toward her with barely concealed amusement. One of them, a large creature with chitinous armor and 4 arms, leaned in toward the other, muttering something she couldn't quite catch. The second alien gave a short, sharp laugh, and they both looked at her again, their gaze heavy with judgment. Maggie tried to ignore them, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped the coffee. It was bitter, with an undertone of something earthy she couldn't place, but she forced herself to drink it. The last thing she wanted was to let their childish behavior rattle her. But the more she tried to focus on her drink, the more the whispers grew. "She's a relic, just like the old Earth museums," one of them said, loud enough for her to hear. The other snickered. "What's she even doing here? Don't they have coffee on their planet?" Maggie's face flushed, and she tried to control her breathing. But the sting of their words felt sharp, cutting through the calm she had been trying to find. She looked down at the table, her eyes scanning the textured wood beneath her hands. But it wasn't enough to escape their gaze. The door to the cafe opened again, and Maggie lifted her eyes, hoping for a distraction. A group of customers entered. Several of them aliens Maggie had seen around the city but hadn't interacted with. They were chatting loudly in their own language, and one of them, a sleek, lithe creature with wings, turned toward her and smirked. "You'll have to move, you know," the winged alien said, his voice dripping with disdain. "That table isn't meant for your kind. We prefer space for those who appreciate art." He gestured vaguely to the paintings around them. Maggie's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and humiliation. She had read stories of how humanity was often considered primitive by other species, but she hadn't expected it to be so raw, so public, here. Before she could muster the strength to stand, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Maggie turned, surprised to hear a familiar voice. It was Isha, her daughter. Isha was everything Maggie wasn't: youthful, confident, and powerfully respected in the intergalactic business world. Maggie had heard stories of her daughter's rise in the corporate realm, but she had never seen her in action. The confidence Isha exuded made Maggie feel even more out of place, but she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The barista stiffened, and the winged alien's expression faltered. "No, no problem at all," the barista stammered, clearly uncomfortable now. "Just a minor misunderstanding." Isha's sharp eyes assessed the room with a quick, practiced glance. Her gaze landed on Maggie, and she frowned as she saw the discomfort etched on her mother's face. She stepped closer to the counter, her voice cool and commanding. "Maggie, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, as if she were already aware of the situation. Maggie swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. I am fine, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding." Isha didn't buy it. She turned back to the barista. "Is this how you treat all your customers?" she asked, her words carrying weight. "My mother is a guest in your establishment. I don't think that's how you're supposed to treat guests. Is it?" The room went silent, and for the first time since she entered, Maggie felt like she might have an ally. Isha's gaze never wavered from the barista, her posture straight and commanding. The tension in the air seemed to thicken as the employees and patrons shifted uneasily. Maggie sat at her table, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, feeling small and out of place in this alien world that seemed so hostile. The barista's eyes darted around, looking for support, but none came. The winged alien who had mocked Maggie earlier now seemed to shrink back, his smug expression replaced by uncertainty. Isha's presence was undeniably powerful, her reputation for being a force in the business world preceding her. "You're going to apologize to my mother?" Isha said, her voice calm but cutting through the silence like a blade. "Right now." The barista opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His fingers twitched nervously, unsure of what to do. The manager of the cafe, who had been lurking in the back, stepped forward with a forced smile, clearly recognizing the woman standing before him. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the manager said, his tone strained. "This is a misunderstanding. There's no need for—" "I don't think you understand," Isha interrupted, her voice sharper now. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. You've humiliated my mother in front of your entire cafe, and you're treating her like she doesn't belong here. This is discrimination, plain and simple." The manager's eyes flickered between Isha and the others in the room. He knew who Isha was, the young woman who had become the face of a restaurant empire in this alien city, who had single-handedly brought together a consortium of multi-species businesses. His gaze flicked nervously to the other patrons, many of whom were now watching the scene unfold with growing interest. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed amused, as if they were witnessing a rare spectacle. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am," the manager said again, his words lacking sincerity. "It's just that we try to maintain a certain atmosphere here. We have strict standards for our clientele." "Standards?" Isha raised an eyebrow. "You mean the standards of not serving someone simply because they're human? That's not a standard. It's prejudice." The tension in the room grew heavier, the weight of Isha's words sinking in. The employees, who had been smug just moments before, now stood frozen, unsure how to handle the situation. Maggie felt a pang of relief in her chest, watching as her daughter took charge, as if her very presence was enough to command respect. Still, she couldn't help but feel the sting of the earlier treatment, the hurt lingering in the back of her mind. "I'm not going to stand by and let you treat my mother like this," Isha continued, her voice calm but firm. I'm the owner of the restaurants you've been partnering with, and I have no tolerance for discrimination, especially from businesses I support. The manager's face drained of color. He fumbled with his words, his apology falling flat as he tried to grasp control of the situation. But Isha wasn't finished. I want a public apology, she said, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. And I want it broadcast throughout the city. You'll let everyone know that this kind of treatment is unacceptable. You'll show your patrons exactly how you plan to address this behavior, or I'll make sure no one in the city ever buys from you again. The room went completely silent. Maggie could feel the weight of her daughter's words, the finality in them. She had seen Isha handle delicate business negotiations before, but this was something entirely different. This was personal, and as Maggie watched, she felt something stirring inside her, a strength she hadn't realized was there. The manager stood frozen, unable to respond, while the barista looked as though he might disappear into thin air. The winged alien who had made the earlier comment now nervously checked his surroundings, realizing that the power dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically. I can assure you, ma'am, the manager stammered, his tone desperate. We will correct this. We'll make an apology, and we'll… No, Isha cut him off. It's not just about saying you're sorry. You need to show you mean it. If you think a simple apology will fix this, then you've misunderstood everything. Isha turned back to Maggie, her face softening for the first time. She walked over to her mother's table, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Mom, you're not a relic. You're not some outdated piece of history. You're important. You matter. And this nonsense ends today. Maggie's eyes stung with the weight of her daughter's words. She had always known Isha was strong, but seeing her confront the prejudice head-on with such confidence was something else entirely. For the first time since entering the cafe, Maggie felt her shoulders relax, the burden of humiliation easing just slightly. Isha turned back to the manager, who had been quiet through their exchange. His discomfort was palpable, but it didn't stop her. If you want to save face, you'll do what I've asked. Otherwise, I'll make sure the entire city knows exactly what kind of place you're running here. The manager nodded shakily, his gaze flicking nervously toward the barista and the other staff members. Of course. We'll do whatever it takes. Public apology right away. Good, Isha said, her voice cool. I'll be expecting the broadcast within the hour. And don't think this is just a one-time thing. If I hear of any other incidents like this, you'll find yourselves out of business. With that, Isha turned her back to the manager and walked back toward her mother's table. Maggie could feel the strength in her daughter's words, the finality that left no room for disagreement. It was clear that this wasn't just about her. Isha was making a statement that no one, not even the most powerful establishments, would get away with mistreating her family. The barista, who had been the first to treat Maggie with disdain, stood there looking like a deer caught in the headlights. His shoulders sagged as he realized the severity of what had just happened. The winged alien, who had once smirked at Maggie, now kept his eyes to the floor, no longer daring to look her way. Maggie sat quietly, absorbing it all. Her daughter had just taken control of the situation in a way Maggie never could have. She was a force of nature that no one dared to challenge. But as they sat in the awkward silence that followed, Maggie knew this was far from over. The cafe may have been forced to apologize, but this moment would ripple through the city. The fight for respect, for equality, had only just begun. And with Isha at her side, Maggie finally felt like she wasn't alone in it. The quiet in the cafe stretched for what felt like an eternity, as the employees scurried to deal with the aftermath of Isha's confrontation. Maggie could feel the heat of everyone's eyes on them, the weight of 100 stares pressing in from every corner. Some patrons had returned to their conversations, but the energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer just a cafe. It was a battleground for respect, where Maggie's presence had forced a reckoning. Isha's hand remained on her mother's shoulder, a grounding presence amidst the chaos. The manager, still visibly flustered, had retreated to the back, no doubt scrambling to prepare the public apology. The barista, who had been the first to disrespect Maggie, was now making himself scarce, avoiding eye contact and lingering by the counter, uncertain of what to do next. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Mom," Isha said softly, her tone a stark contrast to the assertiveness she'd shown moments before. "But you don't have to put up with this." Maggie, still stunned by her daughter's boldness, took a deep breath. She had always known that Isha was strong, but seeing her stand up for her with such force felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. For the first time since they'd arrived, Maggie felt like she could breathe again. "It's just exhausting sometimes, you know?" Maggie said, her voice small. "Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm reminded of how different I am, how Earth is ancient or irrelevant or whatever they think." Isha's expression softened, and she gently squeezed her mother's shoulder. "You're not irrelevant, and the fact that they can't see that is their problem, not yours. You've always been important, Mom. Never forget that." Maggie nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to believe Isha. She wanted to believe that she mattered in this sprawling alien city, surrounded by creatures that viewed her, at best, as a curiosity, and at worst, as a relic from a forgotten time. But her confidence had been chipped away over the years, and moments like this, moments when people openly treated her like she didn't belong, reminded her just how fragile her place was in this world. Before she could respond, the manager returned to the front of the cafe, his posture stiff and formal. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent again, all eyes on him as he stepped toward their table. "I'm truly sorry for the disruption, ma'am," he began, his voice dripping with politeness, though it was clear he was still uncomfortable. "We've taken immediate steps to rectify the situation. A formal apology will be broadcast citywide, as requested. I assure you, this behavior will not be tolerated again." Maggie met his eyes, her gaze cold and unyielding. She didn't need his empty words. She didn't need his apology to feel better. But she understood the necessity of the moment, the theater of it all, and how it could potentially send a message. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of having been humiliated in front of so many people. "I'll hold you to that," Maggie said, her voice steady, but with an underlying edge. "But don't think this ends here. I'll be watching." The manager nodded quickly, eager to retreat. "Of course, ma'am. We appreciate your understanding." Isha didn't move, her gaze locked onto the manager as he scuttled away, no doubt hoping to disappear back into the relative safety of the kitchen. She turned back to Maggie with a raised eyebrow. "You handled that well, but I can tell it still stings." "It does," Maggie admitted, her voice softening. "It's just, I can't shake the feeling that it's always going to be like this. That no matter how much I try to fit in, I'm always going to be the outsider." Isha's hand tightened on her mother's shoulder, her gaze softening. "You're not an outsider, Mom. You never have been. And we'll make sure no one forgets that." There was a moment of quiet between them as Maggie took in her daughter's words. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate Isha's attempts to comfort her. It was just that the scars of years spent as a second-class citizen on a foreign world weren't so easily erased. They lingered, like a weight on her chest, threatening to pull her down with every new encounter. But for the first time in a long while, Maggie allowed herself to believe in Isha's promise. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe things could change. The door of the cafe swung open again, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Maggie's heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. A tall, striking alien with pale blue skin and angular features. His name was Kalen, and he was one of the most influential figures in the city's political scene. He had met Isha a few times, but they hadn't spoken much beyond pleasantries. He was known for his cool demeanor and his strategic mind, but Maggie couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease whenever she saw him. There was something about him that always made her feel like she was being sized up, evaluated, like she wasn't quite part of the same world as him. Kalen's gaze swept across the room, his sharp eyes locking onto Isha and Maggie almost immediately. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene before striding confidently toward their table. "Maggie," he greeted, his voice smooth and calculated. "I didn't expect to see you here today." Isha's posture stiffened slightly, though she kept her tone polite. Kaylin, what brings you to this part of town? I heard about the incident here, he said, sitting down uninvited. His eyes flicking over to the barista and manager who were still lingering near the counter, clearly unnerved by the encounter. It's not every day that someone of your stature has to deal with such trivialities. Maggie's stomach tightened, but she said nothing. She had never quite trusted Kaylin's smooth-talking ways. He was always polite, always charming, but something about him never felt genuine. And now, as he sat across from them, his icy blue eyes studying her like she was a specimen to be observed, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Isha leaned forward slightly, her tone sharp. I hope you're not here to lecture us, Kaylin. We've already dealt with the situation. Oh, no lecture, Kaylin said, his lips curling into a faint smile. I'm simply here to offer my support. There's no reason you should have to put up with such nonsense. As a figure of influence in this city, I'd be happy to help make sure things like this don't happen again. Maggie stiffened at his words. I don't need anyone's help, least of all yours, she said, her voice laced with caution. Kaylin's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. Of course, I just thought, maybe there was something I could do. The silence that followed hung heavy in the air. Maggie didn't know what Kaylin wanted, but she wasn't about to trust him, not after everything she had learned about the city's political landscape. She had a feeling his offer of help came with strings attached. As the tension between them simmered, Maggie felt the ground beneath her shift. The battle wasn't just against the prejudices of the cafe patrons or the city. It was against the deeper currents that ran through the political and social fabric of this alien world, and she wasn't sure who could be trusted anymore. Maggie remained silent as Kaylin's presence loomed over their table. The air around him seemed to crackle with something she couldn't quite place. An unsettling combination of charm and calculation. His posture was impeccable, exuding confidence, but Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface. She had seen people like him before, those who wore kindness like a mask, their true intentions hidden just out of reach. Isha, ever the tactician, took her time before responding, her gaze narrowing slightly as she assessed Kaylin's offer. She was no stranger to the games people like him played, and she wasn't about to let her mother be caught in one of them. We're fine, Isha said, her voice firm and unwavering. We've already taken care of the situation. Kaylin leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. I see. Well, I can respect that. But as I said, if there's ever a moment when you need support, don't hesitate to reach out. The way he said it so nonchalantly made Maggie feel like a pawn in a much larger game. She didn't need his support, not now, not ever. What she needed was respect, dignity, and to be treated as an equal in a world that often treated her as an outsider. But there was no point in arguing with Kaylin. His words were like a river, smooth, controlled, and intended to wear away at any resistance. Isha gave a small nod, acknowledging his words, though Maggie could tell that her daughter wasn't entirely convinced by his feigned sincerity. As Kaylin shifted slightly in his chair, preparing to leave, he shot one last glance at Maggie, a look that felt far too calculating for her comfort. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, Kaylin said, his smile tight and polite. I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon. He rose from the table and walked away, his movements fluid and deliberate. Maggie couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief when he finally left. But as the door clicked shut behind him, she felt a gnawing suspicion in the pit of her stomach. Something about Kaylin didn't sit right with her, and the more she thought about his words, the more she felt like she was missing something important. I don't trust him, Maggie muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Isha's eyes followed Kaylin's retreating figure, her expression guarded. Neither do I, but we'll have to keep an eye on him. People like him always have an agenda. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. Maggie could sense that her daughter wasn't just talking about Kaylin's offer of support. She was talking about the entire system, the power plays, the politics, the unspoken rules of the alien world they now inhabited. It was all a tangled web, and Maggie had a feeling they had only scratched the surface. Do you think he was really offering help? Maggie asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. No, Isha replied flatly, her tone resolute. He's always looking for leverage. People like him never do anything for free. Maggie let out a soft sigh, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I feel like I'm drowning in this place sometimes, Isha. Like I'm just a human in a world that doesn't have any place for me. Everywhere I go, I'm reminded that I'm not enough, that I'll never measure up. Isha's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to gently grasp her mother's hand. You're not alone in this, Mom, and we're not going to let anyone treat you like you're invisible. I promise. Her words brought Maggie a sense of comfort, but the reality of their situation still loomed large. They weren't just fighting the prejudice of a few individuals. They were up against an entire society that had built its foundations on the belief that Earth was a relic, a forgotten corner of the galaxy. No matter how hard Maggie tried to fight that perception, it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. As the day wore on, the two women continued their quiet conversation, discussing their next steps and how best to handle the fallout from the incident at the cafe. They agreed that the public apology was a necessary step, but that it wouldn't be enough. The battle for respect and equality was far from over, and Isha had made it clear that they would keep pushing for change, no matter how many obstacles they faced. By the time the apology broadcast was released, Maggie felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. The manager of the cafe had done exactly as Isha had instructed, releasing a public statement acknowledging the mistreatment and promising to take steps to ensure it never happened again. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small victory in a much larger struggle. Later that evening, as they sat together in their small apartment, Isha's hollow table flickered to life, displaying a map of the city. It was a web of interconnected businesses, political allies, and various factions vying for power. Isha had already begun mapping out a strategy for how they would continue to fight back against the systemic prejudice that ran through the city like an undercurrent. We need allies, Isha said, her finger tracing a line across the map. People who have the power to make real change. We can't keep doing this on our own. Maggie watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Isha had always been the one with the vision, the drive to make things happen. But as much as Maggie admired her, she knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The stakes were high, and the opposition they would face was formidable. I don't know who we can trust anymore, Maggie admitted quietly. Everyone seems to have their own agenda. I can't tell who's really on our side. Isha paused, her hand hovering over the map as she considered her mother's words. That's the hard part, isn't it? Trusting the right people. But we'll figure it out. We have to. The room fell silent as the map hummed softly in the background. Maggie's mind raced with thoughts of the battle ahead, wondering how far they would have to go to make a real difference. She had always known that the fight for her place in this world would be difficult, but now she understood just how complex the struggle would be. As Isha continued to plan their next moves, Maggie's thoughts drifted back to Kalen. His smooth words, his carefully crafted gestures, they all seemed too perfect, too calculated. She couldn't help but feel like he was watching them, waiting for them to make a misstep. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore. We'll need to be careful, Isha, Maggie said, her voice steady. People like Kalen, they don't give up easily. Isha nodded, her eyes focused on the map. I know, but we'll be ready for whatever comes next. Maggie couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The fight had only just begun, and they were about to face a battle that would test everything they had. As the night wore on, Maggie found herself wondering how much more she could take before the weight of it all became too much to bear. And yet, with Isha by her side, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Maggie spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty. The public apology from the cafe was barely enough to soothe her bruised pride, but it had, at least, sent a clear message. The incident had sparked a ripple of attention across the city, and while some had reacted with disdain, others had rallied behind her. There was hope in the air, faint but growing, that change might be possible. But as the days passed, the echoes of that moment continued to haunt Maggie. She knew that small victories weren't enough, This fight would require far more than a few sympathetic words. There were deeper currents at play, and she could feel them pulling at her from all sides. Isha, however, was undeterred. She had always been the strategist, always the one to see the bigger picture. She spent every free moment researching, making connections, and mapping out potential allies. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the system was far more entrenched than either of them had anticipated. On the 5th day after the incident, Isha called Maggie into the main room of their apartment, where the holotable was now displaying a new, updated map of the city. It was crisscrossed with lines, names, and symbols, a visual representation of the political and corporate web that held the city together. Some of the names were familiar: corporate CEOs, political leaders, military commanders. Others were new, names that Maggie didn't recognize, but Isha had noted them with careful precision. "I've been digging," Isha said, her voice steady, though there was an intensity in her eyes. "I found some potential allies, people who might be able to help us navigate this mess." Maggie stood beside her daughter, taking in the sprawling network before them. It looked like a tangled mess of connections, each line leading to a different path, a different possibility. But Isha had already started to make sense of it all, pulling threads together to form a strategy. "Who are they?" Maggie asked, her curiosity piqued. Isha pointed to several names highlighted in bright red. "These are key players in the city's power structure. Some are politicians, others are corporate magnates. They all have influence, but not all of them are friends." Maggie studied the names, recognizing a few, though the rest were unfamiliar. "What do we need them for? I thought the goal was to get people to see us as equals, not make deals with power-hungry elites." Isha's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need allies, Mom. We can't do this alone. And while I'd love to say we can just change things with sheer willpower, the reality is that we're up against the system that's been in place for centuries. We need influence, connections, people who can make things happen." Maggie hesitated, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She had always believed in the strength of their own voices, their own actions. She hadn't wanted to play the game, hadn't wanted to compromise. But Isha was right. To make real change, they would need more than just good intentions. They needed power. "Okay," Maggie said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "So, who do we start with?" Isha tapped the holotable, zooming in on a name at the edge of the map. It was a name Maggie didn't recognize, but the details under the name were enough to spark her interest. "Kalen," Isha said, her voice clipped. "We need to know more about him. He's the most connected person in the city right now. If we can figure out how he operates, we might be able to use his connections for our benefit." Maggie's stomach churned at the thought of Kalen, his icy demeanor and his too-perfect smile still fresh in her mind. She had never trusted him, not even when he offered his help in the cafe. But she couldn't deny that his influence was undeniable. If they could get close to him, it might be the key to shifting the balance of power. "I don't know if I'm ready to work with him," Maggie said, her voice filled with doubt. "He seems like the type to have an agenda behind everything he does." "I agree," Isha replied. "But we don't have to trust him. We just need to play the game." Maggie sighed, rubbing her temples. This wasn't how she had imagined fighting for their place in the world. She had envisioned something more direct, more confrontational. But the longer she stayed in this city, the more she realized that power wasn't always about being loud. It was about being strategic, about knowing when to fight and when to wait. "I'll do it," Maggie said, her voice low but resolute. "But I'm not playing by his rules. If we're going to get close to him, we do it on our terms." Isha smiled, the first hint of approval she'd shown all day. "That's the spirit, Mom." With their plan in place, they spent the next few days preparing. Isha dug deeper into Kalen's background, tracking his movements, analyzing his public statements, and even reaching out to a few of their contacts for information. Maggie, on the other hand, focused on maintaining her composure. She wasn't sure what kind of encounter they would have with Kalen, but she knew she had to be ready for anything. It was on the 6th day that Isha received an unexpected message. It was from Kalen himself. The subject line was simple: "Let's talk." Isha had been expecting this, of course. It was only a matter of time before Kaylin reached out to them directly. But the message sent a fresh wave of unease through Maggie's chest. She had been bracing herself for a confrontation, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. Without hesitation, Isha responded, setting up a meeting for the following evening. Maggie wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. They were walking into dangerous territory. The next evening, they arrived at a sleek, high-rise building in the heart of the city. The building was an imposing structure, its glass walls reflecting the city lights like a giant mirror. Isha had dressed the part. Her usual sharp, confident demeanor was now paired with a tailored suit that gave her an air of authority. Maggie, on the other hand, kept her outfit simple and understated, hoping to blend into the background. She had no intention of letting Kaylin think she was intimidated. The lobby of the building was sleek and minimalist, the soft hum of ambient music filling the air. As they walked toward the elevators, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the building itself was alive, its walls observing every move they made. When the elevator doors finally opened, they were greeted by a security guard who led them to a private suite. The room was opulent, modern furniture, artful lighting, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. At the far end of the room stood Kaylin, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm glad you could make it." Maggie's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral as she stepped into the room. "Let's get this over with," she said, her tone calm but firm. Kaylin smiled, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Of course. I'm sure we have much to discuss." As they took their seats, Maggie's mind raced. This conversation could change everything. Whether they walked out of here with new allies or new enemies would depend on the next few moments. And Maggie wasn't sure which one she feared more. The tension in the room was palpable. Maggie sat across from Kaylin, her fingers gripping the edge of the sleek, modern chair beneath her. Isha, as always, maintained a calm, collected demeanor beside her. But Maggie could feel the undercurrent of uncertainty running between them. Kaylin's eyes, though polite, were calculating, measuring them, gauging their every response. "Thank you for coming," Kaylin said smoothly, his voice cool and controlled. "I trust the city has been treating you well since our last encounter?" Maggie didn't like the way he phrased it, as though he were reminding her of her place in this alien world. But she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "As well as it can, given the circumstances," she replied, her voice steady, though her words held an edge of defiance. Kaylin chuckled softly, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Ah, the circumstances. Yes, I imagine things haven't been easy for you. It's a shame that such unfortunate events have to occur. I was hoping we could discuss how we might avoid more of those in the future." Isha's gaze never wavered from Kaylin, her posture still relaxed but vigilant. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice as sharp as ever. Kaylin's eyes flicked to Isha for a brief moment, his smile widening ever so slightly. "Let's not beat around the bush. You're here because you need my help, and I, in turn, believe that I can be of service. We both want the same thing, after all." Maggie's pulse quickened at his words, but she kept her composure. "We don't need your help, Kaylin," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she intended. "What we need is respect, and we'll get it on our own." He raised an eyebrow at her, a spark of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Is that so? Respect is a complicated thing, Maggie. You can't just will it into existence, especially not in a place like this." Maggie's stomach churned at the casual dismissal in his tone. He was right, of course. She had known from the moment she stepped into this alien world that it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected to feel so small. The truth was, every step they took was a reminder that they were outsiders, humans in a galaxy that seemed to have no place for them. Kaylin continued, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "I understand your pride, truly, but you have to understand that sometimes alliances are more effective than resistance. I could offer you that. An alliance, if you will. A partnership. Isha leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. And what's the catch? Kaylin didn't miss a beat. The catch is simple. In exchange for my support, you'll owe me something. A favor to be paid at a time of my choosing. It's a standard arrangement, nothing more. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She had feared this, the hidden cost of Kaylin's generosity. A favor owed could be anything. And given the kind of person Kaylin was, she knew he would demand something far more dangerous than mere politeness. We don't operate on favors, Maggie said flatly, shaking her head. We don't owe anyone anything. Not even you. Kaylin's smile faltered. Just slightly. But his composure quickly returned. I admire your resolve, he said, his voice colder now. But I'd advise against dismissing an opportunity like this so quickly. You may need my influence more than you realize. Maggie stared back at him, her resolve hardening. She wasn't about to let Kaylin manipulate her. She had seen too many people like him. Those who used their power to create an illusion of control, only to hold it over others when the time was right. And right now, he was trying to create that illusion with her. But she wasn't falling for it. Isha, sensing the growing tension, shifted in her seat and spoke again, her voice cool and calculated. You claim to offer us an alliance, but you haven't explained why. What do you stand to gain from helping us? Kaylin's eyes glinted with something unreadable. Ah, now we're getting to the heart of it, aren't we? He leaned forward, his tone shifting to something more personal. I've been watching you, Maggie. I know what you're capable of, what you could become in this city. I believe your potential is untapped. And in a place like this, potential can be a very valuable thing. Isha raised an eyebrow at Kaylin, her eyes narrowing. And you think that by offering us your help, you'll gain something in return? What is it that you think we have to offer? Kaylin's smile returned, though it was less friendly now, more knowing. What I want isn't just power. What I want is someone who can help me challenge the status quo. Someone who's willing to shake things up. And in case you hadn't noticed, Maggie, you've already made quite a splash here. Maggie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Was he implying that she was just a pawn in his game? That all of her actions, all the struggles she'd faced, were simply tools for his own advancement? The realization stung, and for a moment, she was speechless. I'm not your pawn, Kaylin, Maggie finally managed to say, her voice firm. And I'm not interested in shaking things up for someone else's gain. Kaylin's eyes hardened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth turning up in a faint smile. I'm not asking you to be my pawn, Maggie. I'm offering you a position at the table. The question is, do you want to sit at it or not? The silence in the room was thick. Maggie felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. There was power in his offer, a real, tangible chance to gain influence and respect in this alien world. But at what cost? What would she have to sacrifice to gain that power? Isha glanced at her, her eyes searching Maggie's face for any sign of hesitation. Don't listen to him, Mom. We don't need him. Maggie met her daughter's gaze, her thoughts racing. Isha was right, of course. They didn't need Kaylin. They didn't need anyone but themselves. But deep down, Maggie knew that in order to survive in this world, they would have to play the game. I think we need to go, Maggie said finally, standing up and looking directly at Kaylin. Thank you for your time, but we're not interested in your offer. Kaylin's expression darkened, but he didn't move to stop them. Very well, he said, his voice cold now. But don't make the mistake of thinking you can do this alone. You'll be back. I'll be waiting. Maggie and Isha walked out of the room, the tension of the encounter still hanging in the air. As the elevator doors closed, Isha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was too close, Isha said, her voice low. Maggie nodded, feeling the same unease in her gut. She wasn't sure what to make of Kaylin's offer, but she knew one thing for certain. They were far from done with him. This was just the beginning, and whatever game Kaylin was playing, Maggie was determined to outplay him. But as they walked back to their apartment, a nagging thought lingered in Maggie's mind. Kaylin was right about one thing. They would need power to survive in this world. And whether she liked it or not, the question was no longer about resisting the system. It was about how far she was willing to go to change it. Maggie sat in the dimly lit apartment, her legs folded beneath her as she stared out of the window at the city below. The skyline stretched for miles, gleaming with alien architecture, its spires and towers seemingly alive with light. She had always felt a sense of awe when she looked out at it, but tonight, there was no beauty in it. All she could see was the maze of power structures, each one built on manipulation and control. Her thoughts swirled as the weight of Kalen's offer settled over her. It was tempting, far too tempting, but the price was unclear. He was right about one thing: power in this world didn't come without cost. And if she was going to survive, if she was going to protect her family, she would have to play by their rules. But what did that mean for them? What would she become? Isha was at the small kitchen table, eyes glued to her tablet, a soft hum of concentration surrounding her as she read something Maggie couldn't quite make out. But her daughter's silence was a stark contrast to Maggie's spiraling thoughts. They both knew the stakes. They both knew the fight wasn't over yet. "Mom!" Isha's voice broke through the quiet, pulling Maggie's attention back to her. "There's something you need to see." Maggie blinked, her mind still racing as she stood and walked over to the table. "What is it?" Isha turned the screen toward her, revealing a series of articles and videos that Maggie hadn't expected to see. They were about Kalen, specifically about his influence within the city. He was no mere power player. He was an architect of the political landscape. His family's grip on various factions was tighter than Maggie had realized, and the implications of his offer were even more dangerous than she had thought. "I've been digging," Isha said, her tone soft but resolute. "Kalen's not just someone we can walk away from. He has ties to every major sector. He controls security forces, trade routes, even public opinion. We can't just ignore him, and we can't afford to make him our enemy." Maggie leaned over the tablet, her eyes scanning the information. The more she read, the clearer it became. If they were going to make a stand, they couldn't do it alone. They'd need allies, and not just any allies. They would need to outsmart Kalen at his own game. Her chest tightened as she realized the magnitude of the decision in front of her. If they were going to succeed, they'd need leverage. And right now, Kalen had all the leverage. "I don't like this," Maggie murmured, more to herself than Isha. "But we don't have much of a choice." Isha stood, her face hardening. "You don't have to make a decision tonight, Mom. But we're not backing down from him. I'm going to find another way." Maggie looked at her daughter, the weight of the situation sinking in. "You're right. We don't back down. But we need to be careful. One wrong move and everything could fall apart." "I know," Isha said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We'll figure this out. Together." Maggie nodded, even though doubt lingered. She had always trusted Isha's instincts, but this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far darker than either of them realized. The next day, Maggie and Isha made their way through the crowded streets, their destination set firmly in mind. They needed to speak with a few people, a few key players who might have the influence to help them with their next move. As much as Maggie hated the idea, she had to admit that this was the only way forward. If Kalen had his hands in everything, then they needed to find a way to outmaneuver him. But their path was not going to be easy. As they entered one of the city's more discreet districts, Maggie's senses heightened. She could feel the eyes on them, the subtle tension in the air as they moved deeper into the territory of people who lived in the shadows of the political elite. It wasn't long before they found their contact, an old associate of Isha's who had some sway within the underground networks. Maggie was not sure how she felt about the deal they were about to strike, but she didn't have time to question it now. They had to act fast. Inside a dimly lit bar, they met with Darian, a well-known broker with connections to smugglers, mercenaries, and various other unsavory types. He was a middleman, but in this world, middlemen held power. Darian leaned back in his chair, swirling a drink in his hand as he assessed them both. His sharp eyes flicked from Maggie to Isha, and for a moment Maggie felt like she was being weighed and measured. But she remained calm. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of someone like Darian would be the end of the conversation. "Kalen, huh?" Darian said after a pause, his lips curling into a smile that was more sneer than anything else. You've got big plans if you're here asking for help with him. Isha didn't waste time with pleasantries. We're here because we need leverage. Kalen has his hands in everything, and if we're going to move against him, we need something he can't control. Darian's gaze flicked to the glass in his hand, then back to Isha. Leverage, you say? Well, let me tell you something. Leverage isn't just about power. It's about secrets. And Kalen's got a lot of them. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean by that? Darian leaned in, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. Kalen's family has a lot of skeletons in the closet. I've got eyes and ears all over the city. If you're serious about going up against him, I can get you the intel you need. But it's not cheap. Maggie exchanged a look with Isha, who nodded. How much? Darian smirked. Not money. Information. I want you to do something for me. Something small but useful. In return, I'll give you what you need. A nice, tidy package of Kalen's dirty little secrets. Maggie didn't like the way he phrased it, but she knew they had no other choice. They needed that intel. The tension between them and Kalen was about to escalate, and they had to be ready. She took a breath, trying to steel herself for the deal they were about to make. I'll agree to your terms, Maggie said, her voice firm. Darian's smile widened. Good. Then let's get to work. As they left the bar, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a line. One they couldn't uncross. They were now in the game for real, and there was no turning back. With the intel they'd soon have, they would have Kalen cornered. But the question remained. When they finally had him, what would they do with him? Maggie wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. They weren't going down without a fight. Maggie could feel the pressure mounting as she sat across from the members of the underground network. The air in the room was thick with tension, and her every instinct screamed that they were nearing a point of no return. They had come this far. There was no backing down now. They had to outplay Kalen, and every decision from here on out would determine the outcome. The meeting room was stark and utilitarian, with just enough light to illuminate the faces of the people gathered around the table. Isha was beside her, her expression tight but focused, her mind already racing ahead to the next move. The stakes were too high for mistakes, and they both knew it. What had begun as a fight for survival had turned into something far more dangerous. Darian, the broker who had provided them with Kalen's secrets, leaned forward, his fingers steepled together as he regarded them with a knowing look. He was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. The papers in front of him contained details about Kalen's network. Every corrupt deal, every shady alliance, and every dirty secret that could be used to destabilize him. And that was exactly what Maggie intended to do. Do you have a plan? Darian asked, his voice low and measured. Maggie nodded, her mind still working through the intricacies of the situation. She had gathered enough to strike, but now she needed to figure out how to do so without pushing things too far. It wasn't just about pulling off a successful move. It was about timing, precision, and leverage. One wrong word, one wrong action, and everything could crumble. We've got enough dirt on Kalen to make him panic, Maggie replied, her voice steady. But we need to hit him where it hurts most. Not just his reputation, but his control over the power structures he's built. If we can show that his empire is vulnerable, we can make him back down. Isha spoke up, her tone sharp. But we can't give him the upper hand. He's already made it clear that he's willing to do whatever it takes to keep his grip on power. We need to anticipate his next move. Darian glanced between them, then gestured toward a map spread out on the table. The map detailed key locations, Kalen's headquarters, the homes of his allies, and several public-facing businesses that were fronts for his operations. You're right, but to move against Kalen, you need to be able to hit him from every angle. We can't give him time to react. He's already preparing for a counterattack, I can guarantee it. Maggie's pulse quickened. Then we need to be quicker. Isha leaned in, scanning the map. What about his family? His sister, Illyria? She's been with him since the beginning. If we can turn her against him, maybe that'll be the leverage we need. Darian's smile was slow and deliberate. Illyria is a thorn in Kalen's side. She's not as loyal to him as she once was, but she's dangerous. Get to her, and you could cause a rift between them. Maggie's mind raced as she considered the implications of turning Kalen's family against him. Illyria was known for her cold demeanor, but she had her own ambitions, and Maggie had heard rumors of her growing discontent with Kalen's methods. If they could exploit that, they might just have the key to breaking him. We'll need to move carefully, Maggie said, thinking aloud. Illyria is volatile, but she's not stupid. She'll see us coming if we don't have something solid to offer. Isha's voice was soft but resolute. Maybe we don't need to offer her anything. Maybe we just need to make her realize that Kalen isn't as invincible as he thinks. Maggie looked at her daughter, the fire in her eyes matching her own. We can do that, but we need to make sure Illyria is on our side before we make any moves against Kalen. Without her, we risk everything. Darian sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the table. You've got a lot of guts, I'll give you that. But guts alone won't win this. You're going to need to pull off something big. You're not just playing against Kalen anymore. You're playing against the entire system he controls. Maggie clenched her fists, her mind already moving toward the next phase of their plan. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Kalen was watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, and if they didn't strike quickly, they would lose the advantage. We'll make the move on Illyria, Maggie said, her voice firm. And once she's with us, we go after Kalen's network. We hit the financials, destabilize his supporters, and make him realize that his empire is crumbling. Isha nodded. And we make it personal. We show him that we're not just some small-time players. We're a threat to everything he's built. Darian raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by their resolve. You've got your work cut out for you, but I'll help you. I can get you into Illyria's inner circle, but it'll cost you. Maggie looked at him, eyes narrowed. What do you want? Darian smiled, his teeth glinting in the dim light. A favor. You don't have to give it to me now, but when the time comes, you'll owe me one. It's a small price to pay for the information I'm giving you. Maggie hesitated, but only for a moment. Deal. They sealed the agreement with a nod, and Maggie knew there was no going back now. They were in this together for better or worse. As Maggie and Isha left the underground meeting space, a heavy silence settled between them. It wasn't fear, but the recognition that they were about to cross into dangerous territory. They had a plan, but the true test lay ahead. They were going to need every ounce of strength and cunning to pull this off. And if they failed, Maggie didn't want to think about failure. She couldn't afford to. We'll make it, Isha said, as if reading her mind. We have to. Maggie squeezed her daughter's shoulder. We will. We're not backing down. Not now. As they walked into the night, the weight of their decision pressed down on them. But there was no turning back. They were heading into the heart of the storm, and they wouldn't stop until Kalen's empire came crashing down. The tension in the air was palpable as Maggie stood outside Kalen's high-rise, her heart beating faster with every passing second. They had come a long way, too far to turn back now. This was it. The final confrontation. All the pieces were in place and there was no room for error. She had used everything at her disposal to get here. Every bit of leverage, every secret, every connection. But now it was time for action. Isha stood beside her, her posture just as tense but determined. Her fingers tapped anxiously on her tablet, double-checking the security feeds from the building's various levels. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. They had to move swiftly, decisively. They couldn't afford to let Kalen get the upper hand. Not now. I'm in, Isha said, her voice barely above a whisper. The system's down for now. We've got a small window before they realize what's happening. Maggie nodded, trying to quell the anxiety rising in her chest. Good. We move fast. Get Illyria on our side, and we take Kalen down. They made their way into the building, slipping past the security checkpoints with ease. They were shadows, unseen by anyone, but each moment felt like a countdown. Kalen's empire wasn't built on trust. It was built on fear, and fear had a way of making people reckless. Maggie and Isha had exploited that recklessness, using it to crack open Kalen's defenses one by one. But this would be the final blow. As they approached the elevator, Maggie couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about taking down a man. This was about toppling an entire system of corruption. Kalen was a symbol of everything wrong with the city, with the society they lived in. The idea that one man could control so much power, could manipulate so many lives, was something Maggie couldn't accept. "Isha," she said, her voice low but steady. "When we meet Illyria, we can't show any hesitation. She needs to see that we have the upper hand. We don't just want her on our side. We need her to believe we're the only way forward." Isha's face hardened in response. "I know. I'm ready." The elevator doors slid open, and they stepped inside. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine as the doors closed behind them, the silence inside thick with anticipation. It felt like the calm before a storm, the quiet moments before everything was set in motion. There was no turning back now. The ride to the top floor seemed to stretch on forever, the small, steady hum of the elevator only adding to the tension. As the elevator slowed and the doors slid open with a soft chime, they were greeted by the sight of the sleek, modern interior of Kalen's penthouse. The soft glow of lights reflected off polished surfaces, and the entire place seemed designed to exude power and control. But Maggie wasn't fooled. She knew this was nothing more than an elaborate facade. They stepped inside, making their way down a long hallway toward the private office where Kalen held court. The guard stationed outside didn't give them a second glance. They were in the middle of a massive security breach, and their attention was diverted. But it wouldn't be long before someone realized what had happened. Time was running out. As they approached the office doors, Maggie paused. This was it. Everything had led to this moment. She could feel the weight of every decision, every risk, pressing on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Kalen was standing near the window, his back to them as he looked out over the city. For a moment, he didn't acknowledge their presence, but Maggie could feel the tension in the room shift. He knew they were here. He had known all along. "So, you've come for me." Kalen's voice was smooth, devoid of any emotion. He didn't turn to face them, his gaze still fixed on the skyline. Maggie stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You've been controlling the city for far too long, Kalen. It's time for that to end." Kalen turned slowly, a small, almost amused smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You think you can take me down? You think you can just waltz in here and disrupt everything I've built?" "We've already done that," Isha said, stepping forward beside her mother. "You've already lost. It's just a matter of time before everyone realizes it." Kalen's expression darkened, but he didn't move. "You think Illyria is going to side with you? She's not going to betray me. You're wasting your time." "Then you haven't been paying attention," Maggie said coldly. "We've already got her. She's on our side now." Kalen's eyes flicked briefly to the door, and in that moment, Maggie saw it. The flicker of fear. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Illyria was his weakness, the one thing he couldn't control, and they had exploited that. Maggie had known from the beginning that Illyria's loyalty was shaky at best. But this was the moment that Kalen's grip on his empire would slip. "Don't be so sure," Kalen sneered, stepping closer. "Illyria might be in your pocket for now, but that doesn't mean you've won." "We don't need her to win," Isha replied, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We've already exposed you for what you are. Your empire is falling apart. The people you've crushed are rising up, and they're going to take everything from you." Kalen looked at them both, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. But beneath it, there was something else. Something Maggie hadn't expected to see. Fear. He wasn't in control anymore. He was a man whose empire was crumbling, and he knew it. For a long moment, neither side moved. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of what was happening. The world outside continued, indifferent to the battle taking place within the walls of Kalen's high-rise. But inside this room, everything had changed. Maggie took a deep breath and stepped forward. "It's over, Kalen. Your time is up." Kalen's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Maggie thought he might lash out. But then he just turned away, his shoulders slumping as if he had given up. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Kalen muttered. his voice defeated. You think you've won? You think this will stop anything? There's always someone else waiting to take my place. Maggie shook her head. Not this time. The people you've betrayed aren't going to let that happen anymore. Kaylin said nothing as she and Isha turned to leave. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As they stepped out of the penthouse and back into the hallway, Maggie felt a sense of finality wash over her. They had done it. They had taken down Kaylin. But the real work was just beginning. They would rebuild. They would fight for a better future. And this time, they wouldn't let anyone stand in their way. But for now, at least they had won. And that was enough.